Good morning, geography class. Let's get started with the Deep South. And just by way of introduction, the southern part of America has been called the Deep South ever since colonial times. It would be referred to as, the part of the U.S. that is on the Gulf of Mexico. It is a lot of coastal plain on the Gulf of Mexico and the southern part of the Atlantic. And there's a lot of minorities here. Many of them do not come willingly, if you catch my drift. There has been a history of racial tension in the Deep South, especially. This is where racism was the worst. And because of this, it's also where a lot of civil rights firsts happened. It's where the main fight for civil rights was. So a lot of famous characters and events from our civil rights history were from the far deep South. That's where it was needed the most, so that's where it was. All right, South Carolina first. You have two distinct sections. You have the low country here on the coast, and then, of course, you have the upstate with some mountains and hills there. Charleston, South Carolina, is the largest harbor in the South, and at the time of the Civil War, something like two-thirds of the cotton harvest from the South went through Charleston port. So very, very important strategic city. And remember, in colonial times, the Southern plantation economy was all geared towards selling stuff to Europe, especially cotton, selling cotton to Europe. And a lot of that had to go through the coastal ports of Charleston, Savannah, and New Orleans. Because of that, right after the War of 1812, we decided that we needed to really strengthen our defenses all up and down the coastline of the Atlantic, just in case England decided to try anything again. So we built a series of the biggest, best, most technologically advanced forts that we could possibly build all up and down the coast, and the biggest and best was in Fort Sumter. Fort Sumter is in a tiny island in the middle of the harbor, like smack dab in the middle of Charleston Harbor. You cannot go on either side without being in range of its guns. This was a tiny sandbar that was not big enough for any fortification, so they expanded it, and it is a man-made island. Maybe you can tell the walls are right up against the shoreline. It is built with gigantic masonry, giant stones and concrete, and was very, very, very powerful. Unfortunately, by the time of the Civil War, it had been in disrepair. It had never actually been finished. It was costing too much, and we weren't figuring on going to war with England anytime too soon. So they hadn't ever finished it or moved into it. There were no cannons there. There were some of the walls were unfinished. And the U.S. troops that were stationed in Charleston were actually on another fort on one of the banks. And that fort was also in crazy disrepair. The walls on the land side had broken down so much that you could walk up the rubble and over the wall. So it was completely indefensible. And when things looked bad, Colonel Anderson and his troops moved from that tiny little fort all the way to Fort Sumter across the harbor in the middle of the night. They brought all their cannons with them. They only had a couple hundred men, though, and Fort Sumter was designed to hold something like 4 or 5 thousand men. So they were completely understaffed. They only had a handful of cannons, and they couldn't even man all the cannons that they had. So completely understaffed. But imagine what would have happened if we were able to keep Charleston, South Carolina at the beginning of the Civil War. Civil War may have lasted 6 months if we did that instead of almost 6 years. Yeah, so the Battle of Fort Sumter was the first shooting of the Civil War. They shot cannons at each other from the banks to the fort and back all day long. There was heavy fighting. However, because Fort Sumter was far enough away, those cannonballs did lose a lot of their kinetic energy by the time they reached one another. And after a full day shooting, there was one casualty, and that was a horse. Poor horse got left out in the open and got struck right in the center. He's gone. But everyone else, there were a few injuries from gas inhalation, like smoke inhalation from the gunpowder. There were a few minor burns and cuts and scrapes from chips of brick and whatever flying. But the masonry of the forts were so powerful, they could not hurt each other. So after all day of fighting, the men at Fort Sumter had lost all their ammunition, and so they had to surrender. No point in just sitting there being bombarded. And that was the end of the very first battle of the Civil War. Nobody died. In upstate, upstate South Carolina, we have three important cities: Columbia, South Carolina; Greenville, South Carolina; and Spartanburg. Perhaps you're familiar with Greenville, South Carolina. I lived there for a year, or just outside of Greenville, actually, and I taught just outside of Greenville. And Greenville is the home to Bob Jones University, one of Christianity's premier universities. Been there multiple times as well. Very beautiful campus. Interesting fact about South Carolina is that they grow more peaches than Georgia does, but for some reason everyone likes thinking about Georgia as the peach state, but there you go. And it is very agricultural, especially in the low country, very agricultural. And I believe it is Spartanburg that is home to one of America's BMW plants. If you do not know, BMW stands for Bavarian Motor Works, only in German, Motor Gewerken, something like that. So even some imported car companies do have many, many jobs in America. So, some people are like, buy American cars. If you buy a BMW in America, some of that money does go back to Germany, but a lot of that money stays in places like South Carolina, where a lot of the manufacturing jobs are. So that's nice. It's kind of sort of buying American. It is supporting some American jobs, not as much as maybe Ford, but it's still somewhat buying American. That's good, keeping our money in our country. Next up is Georgia. Georgia was the last of the 13 colonies to be colonized by far, and it was set up as a penal colony where Britain sent all their prisoners. It's actually started as almost a charity. There was a Quaker who thought that the poorhouses and prisons in England were just terrible and were not helping the prisoners at all. So he said, instead of punishing people for being poor and for taking loans that they could not pay back, why don't we try to rehabilitate these people, bring them to Georgia, make them work their rears off, clearing the wilderness. And if you're a pioneer, you're way too busy and working hard to get into any trouble, and hopefully you'll be a good member of society again. And this Quaker in charge, he said, because this is a colony of mostly ex-prisoners, some of them, cons, some of them just poor people, no alcohol allowed here. That'll help their rehabilitation to society. Also, no slavery allowed in Georgia. And it was not until decades later that the people of Georgia got fed up and they appealed to the king and said, we want alcohol and we want slaves. And the king allowed them to have alcohol and slaves. Georgia is famous for the three P's: peaches, pecans, and peanuts. Uh, Three very popular and expensive agricultural products. Maybe not so much the peanuts, but the peaches and pecans. Peaches are a really wonderful southern treat. They only grow in very warm climates, although today the north is getting a little bit warmer. So peaches are actually growing better in Pennsylvania now than they ever have. We've also made some species of peaches that are more cold resistant. I guess not species, varieties. It's a subspecies. Like we have dozens of varieties of apples. They can do the same thing with peaches. That's really cool. It is difficult to ship peaches because they are so squishy and they bruise and rot really easily. But in modern times, we have figured out the hormones that tell peaches when to ripen. So you can pick underripe peaches, ship them, and when they get to their destination, spray them with a synthetic hormone tells it when to ripen. It's the exact same chemical as it would get on the trees. We do that with bananas as well. Ship the green bananas. When they get to store, you dip them in a product that makes them turn yellow in just a few days. Pecans, pecans, or pecans are a very famous southern treat. Pecan pie. Uh, Nuts are usually very expensive because they are very water intensive, and those trees take up a lot of space. You can't, cram a new tree every few yards. And they also take decades to mature. If you plant a pecan, it's going to take many, many, many years before it's growing more than a handful of nuts. They're also very water intensive. So in some places of the country where water is at a premium, like in California, California grows a lot of our nuts, almonds and stuff, and that can be very difficult to get enough water. So in droughts, they don't do so well. I saw what's the guy? Smarter Every Day on YouTube. He lives down south and he shows how to harvest pecans. It's really, really fun. You get something that looks kind of like a forklift, but it has these two rubber arms, and it grabs the tree and goes, "Daw!" and it shakes the tree, and this massive tree is getting vibrated, and all the nuts just come crashing down. And then you get this like a snowplow to pick it up. And I'm getting a text. I am Mr. Popular today. All right. Peanuts. I'm sure you've heard the story of George Washington Carver and the peanuts. Peanuts are called that because they are a legume. They are like peas. Their species is very similar to other types of peas and beans. They are weird in that they grow underground, but not underground like roots. So you have just this normal bush-looking thing. Then the end of the bush grows tendrils, and those tendrils go back to the ground, burrow underground, and then start growing. So peanuts grow underground, but not on the roots. It goes up and then down. Peanuts used to be used as like a trash crop. You grow that if you can't grow anything else, and you feed it to the animals, and maybe the kids want a handful of them. But it went from that to an American staple, an American favorite, very, very quickly. And that is all due to George Washington Carver. The cotton takes up so much nitrogen from the soil that after just 2 or 3 years, your cotton field will grow something like a quarter of what it used to be. And after 10 years, your cotton field is only producing about a tenth as much cotton as it used to. So George Washington Carver said, how can we get that nitrogen back into the soil? And he found out that peas and beans of all kinds put nitrogen back into the soil. So he said, okay, so how can we convince farmers to grow that? And so he invented about 500 different things you can do with peanuts, including using the peanut oil for frying and as a base for paint. And as a motor lubricant, peanut oil will work just as good as any other oil. Using the shells for a drywall substitute, put it in your house, all sorts of really cool stuff. There's Georgia peaches. There's pecans. I love them. Pecans, as a New Englander would say. There's some peanuts growing underground. You know what they do down south? I've never tried this because it just sounds so gross. Boiled peanuts. There are boiled peanuts everywhere, little stands on the side of the road. And they just take the whole peanuts in the shell and everything, and they boil them in salty water, and then they hand them to you, and you eat them, and the shell gets all like slimy and slurpy, so you slurp down the shell and crunch the peanuts. I think sounds nasty, but they say it's really good. I've never had the heart to try them. Another weird thing Southerners do is put salted peanuts in their Coke. So get a glass of Coke, put the peanuts in it. They say the sweet and salty, smooth and crunchy contrast is a fun thing. My brother David tried it and he loves it, but again, that's weird. I do not want chewy Coca-Cola. No, thank you. Another thing that made peanuts really, really popular in the South is this bug up here. This is called the boll weevil, and they were literally that big. No, just kidding. These are little beetles that love eating cotton. For whatever reason, they will only eat cotton, and they were destroying hundreds of thousands of acres of cotton in the South. And so people are saying the only way to get rid of the boll weevils is to have a wide stretch of farms that don't grow any cotton at all. But cotton is the major cash crop. But if we don't grow the cash crop now, we can grow a lot more later. If we do grow it now, the boll weevil will just infest everywhere. So we have to alternate growing this cash crop with some junk crop. And so peanuts was the go-to. And once there was a market for peanuts, then peanuts became more popular and the price went up. And the people of South Carolina now put up this statue honoring the boll weevil, teaching them that you should grow more than just one crop. Growing a single crop is not good for the overall economy. It is good to have a variety of different things, even from year to year, and then from farm to farm. It is good to grow a variety of different things. If the entire state is just growing cotton and there's a problem with cotton, like a bug infestation, your entire state's economy is ruined, and you really do not want that. But if even just half the farmers alternate from cotton to peanuts or some other product every year, then the boll weevil has a much harder time jumping from farm to farm to farm to farm. It's contained, and that helps everybody. So they put up this statue in praise of the boll weevil that saved the economy of the South. Atlanta, Georgia is the home of Coca-Cola. Here is another bottling plant in Macon, Georgia. I do believe they have multiple different factories and sites there, and they have an awful lot of business in Georgia. Maybe you've heard about Georgia's new voting restriction laws. There's definitely some unfortunate stuff going on in the state of Georgia. Um, we don't need to talk about that, but Coca-Cola is threatening to leave Georgia because they do not like this new law. And if they do that, they're going to take hundreds of thousands of jobs with them, and that would not be good. I mean, it wouldn't be good for Georgia. Florida next. Florida has the Panhandle along the top, the peninsula down south. Uh, Perhaps you've heard of the Florida Everglades, this beautiful swampy area. I don't know about beautiful. I don't like swamps very much. I do see and appreciate the beauty of it. These swamps are so thick with vegetation that you cannot take a regular boat out there because even a propeller that's just 6 inches or 8 inches lower than the boat will get all tangled up in weeds. So you know how they move their boats around when they go gator hunting? They got a giant fan on top of the boat, a giant fan like 10 feet, 8 feet, 10 feet diameter, and it just pushes the boat forward. Um, Pretty cool air power. And then you have a very thin boat, very wide. So it has almost no depth at all, and it could go right over the top of all those weeds and get those gators and pythons and anacondas and giant snails and who knows what else. Wow, my pictures are all messed up. Anyway, perhaps you've heard of Orlando, Florida before. Perhaps you've been there. I know several people in school have. Home to two major theme parks, Universal Studios and Disney. And those places have been hit hard by the pandemic, having to close, and they made millions a day. And then they had to close all summer long last summer. They're hoping to reopen to full capacity this summer, but I don't know. Let's see what happens. Uh, Again, having a single thing as a single product for your economy is great when it goes great and it's terrible when it goes terrible. So Orlando is 100% geared towards tourists. So you have Universal and Disney, but then you have all the hotels and you have all the restaurants and you have all the other tourist attractions. There is a Bible theme park that we went to. Brittany and I went there once. Very cheesy, but they had a Bible theme park, Holy Land Experience. Everything is tourist centered. And so when a pandemic hits and there are no tourists, oh, big problem. Thankfully for Disney, though, they have bought up the entire entertainment business, it seems like, and they have made a lot of money off of Disney Plus streaming, so they don't have to worry so much about the loss of revenue of their theme park. They are still rolling in cash, so you don't have to worry about them. Universal Studios, of course, is also a movie company that made theme parks that go along with its movies. So they still have a lot of streaming and whatnot. So you don't have to worry about them either. They're fine. Cape Canaveral, Florida is our launch site for NASA. Uh, do you know why our space shuttles and rockets and satellites get launched from Florida? There is a geographic reason. I can't remember if I've said that here or not. I think I have in French Guiana. It's close to the equator. The Earth spins faster at the equator than at the poles. So the closer to the equator you are, the more of a boost you can get on liftoff. Because as soon as you lift off, you're already going as fast as the Earth was spinning. So if you go in the right direction, you get this massive speed boost. So you definitely want to go as far south as possible. Look up on YouTube, look up space shuttle launch. I had it in my history video, actually. We're talking about the space race. So fun. Um, I think Crystal Jones just mentioned in Facebook a few weeks ago that she saw some kind of rocket take off while she's down there, and she got a good view of that. So that's pretty cool. Look at Crystal Jones's Facebook, see if you can see something fun. The Florida Keys are these series of islands down in the south of Florida, again, very touristy. And today, do you see what's connecting all those keys? There is an interstate highway that connects all of those keys. So they are, rather close to one another, close enough for bridges and causeways and things. That's cool. They're all sandbar islands, so they're very low in elevation. Do you know what famous agricultural product comes from the Florida Keys? The key limes. Key limes are not the same as regular limes. They are much bigger, like the size of lemons. They're huge for limes, and they're much, much sweeter. Typically, lemons are rather sour, and limes are kind of bitter. But key limes are not. They're beautifully delicious. So if you ever see key lime juice in the grocery store, probably be easier to find that than key limes. But if you ever see key lime juice, go ahead and snag that and make some limeade or make some key lime pie. Oh, so good. Key lime pie is just a curd. It's really simple to make a curd. It's just like a pudding. You get some egg yolks, you get some butter, you cook it up, some sugar, and then just let it cool. And really, really easy and simple to make and delicious. Put some whipped cream on top, golden. Florida is, of course, known for a lot of different citrus fruits, including oranges, but they also grow lemons, grapefruit, limes, pomelos, tangerines, all sorts of great stuff. And there's a picture of some of the highways going out. They can make giant bridges like this pretty easily because the water depth is very shallow. So they don't need to do a giant suspension bridge. They could just have these pylons, these piles, every few yards that are just concrete steps, and they're fine. Pretty cool. There's a lot of citrus. I would love to go to a pick your own orange stand. They have those, just like you have pick your own apples in New England, pick your own oranges. They say the scent of an orange orchard is just heavenly. Really, really cool. You know what? The leaves of citrus fruits are also delicious, and lime leaves and lemon leaves are often used as flavorings in various Middle Eastern and North African cuisines. Americans don't use them for some reason. But I have seen, what's it called? Like cologne and perfumes that have like lemon leaf extract in it. Slightly different scent than the fruit itself, less sweet and more tangy. So cool. And yeah, they get a lot of tourism. A lot of snowbirds go down to Florida. Next up, Alabama. Deep in the heart of Dixie, Texas, whatever. Uh, Alabama is famous for a couple giant cities like Montgomery and Birmingham. Birmingham is right above the A here in the map. During the 60s, Birmingham was nicknamed Bombingham because there were so many bombs let off by the KKK and other people, and these were almost all in black churches and black schools. Now, how awful do you have to be to say, I hate you so much, I'm going to blow up your church? This is American terrorism. People today are scared that Muslims are going to blow up churches. Well, we did have people blow up churches in America. They were Americans blowing up black churches in the South. And there are so many churches and schools bombed. Little kids killed. So sad that it was called Bombingham. And unfortunately, the cops did not seem to care or really want to stop it. And very little happened for, a decade as there's bombs being let off all the time. So sad. It would be very hard for me to live in Birmingham. Maybe you've heard the story of the March to Selma. So down south, after the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments were passed, gave black people their freedom, and then allowed them to be full citizens, and then finally to vote as well. There were many people who did not want black people to vote, and so when black people went to register to vote, they would be refused. So even though the law says you're allowed to vote, they wouldn't do that. So in Selma, there was this big march to protest that, and Martin Luther King Jr. and a bunch of other people organized a march from Selma to the capital, Montgomery. We're just going to walk there the entire way. It's going to take us a while. We're going to walk to Selma, and this whole crowd of people is going to show up at the courthouse and say, we want to register to vote. Now in America, it is very easy to register to vote. You just have to show your identification, show who you are, where you live, probably 2 pieces of mail addressed to you at your place, and then you just fill out your name and information. When I registered to vote in Maine, probably took me all of a minute and a half to put in my name, date of birth, stuff like that, show the lady my 2 pieces of mail, and I'm golden. Well, along the way, they were stopped by cops who said, "You have to go home." And they said, "No, we don't. We have the right to peacefully protest. We have the right to walk wherever we want. It's a free country. We're allowed to walk." And so the cops beat them up and threw tear gas at them, threw dogs at them. One of the gentlemen in front, his name was John Lewis. He was like 19 at the time, I think. He had his hands in his pockets so that no cop could possibly think that he was a threat or trying to fight back. And with his hands in his pockets, several cops descended on him and whacked him with sticks, batons, cracked his skull open, and left him on the side of the road for dead. He did survive, and he grew up to become a U.S. congressman, and he has been in Congress for a very long time. I think he just passed away recently, if I'm recalling correctly, like a couple years ago. Well, this whole protest started because there was another bomb in a church in Alabama. This time it killed 4 little kids and injured 17, some of them pretty horrifically. So 4 little kids are bombed because some people don't want them to vote. So sad. People were like, we're done with this. That got nationwide attention. Several years ago, probably 4 years ago, 4 or 5 years ago, I was given a DVD in the mail of a movie called Selma. It is very historically accurate. It is very disturbing and violent. If you want to see it, ask your parents. I'd be happy to let you have it. I'm not going to show it in class. It's that violent, but it is exactly what happened at Selma. When the movie came out, some historical society paid to send a copy of that DVD to every single history teacher in America that they could find at least. So I got one in the mail. If you'd like to watch it with parental supervision, I'd be happy to lend it to you. It is very sad though, but it's very, very important that we remember what happened in our South so that it will never happen again. We cannot prevent people from voting. We cannot beat up people for exercising their free rights. Alabama today is known for its steel and its cotton. It's still the heart of cotton land in America. Today, we can make nitrogen in a factory and just put this nitrogen fertilizer on the ground, so we do not have to worry about that. And our cotton today grows bigger and better than ever. They're also really into their steel. So they have like college football teams called the Steelers, kind of like Pittsburgh. They also have a lot of high-tech factories that make very, very technically specific parts, like parts for NASA. Here's a big convention center at one of the factories that they made parts for NASA. And you know how awesome the engineering has to be to put it in a literal spaceship. You know, people talk about rocket science, but the science is probably the easy part. The engineering is the hard part. Knowing what to make to get into space, that's one thing, but actually making it, and we're talking about things that have to be exactly the right shape and size, half a millimeter off and the whole thing will explode. You know, it has to be perfect, and it's very high tech, high precision work making those parts. Tuskegee University is in Alabama, founded by Booker T. Washington, who was freed right after the Civil War when he was like 4 or 5. He was a very young man, and he went on to get an excellent education and then provide education for other Black people. And probably the most famous professor at Tuskegee was this man, George Washington Carver, who is not only famous for his peanuts, he did lots and lots of stuff with botany. He was an incredibly clever botanist and chemist. Amazing life story. Read about his life story. It's way, way more than peanuts. He reintroduced dill to America. Dill is delicious. And people in the South thought dill was a nasty weed. He would go out in the forest and pick some weeds and put it in a salad saying, this is amazing. And now people in America love dill. That's fun. Yeah, George Washington Carver, very clever, very amazing man. Big part of Alabamian history. Next is Mississippi. Mississippi is a Native American word that means wide river or big river, something like that. So, you know, no one's good at making names. It's a river. It's big. Yeah, okay. Good name. I guess it is. Mississippi is almost entirely coastal plain. You know what that means? Mississippi mud. This is Mississippi mud pie. They're famous for their dark, almost black mud throughout most of the state that is just so dense and rich in nutrients. That is why it's black. The darker it is, the more good stuff is in there. They're so famous for their mud that I couldn't even find any pictures of real Mississippi mud on Google. I just find pictures of Mississippi mud pie. So to honor their mud, there's this dish where you get brownies or cake, chocolate cake as the bottom layer. Then you put fluff on top of that and a bunch of chocolate sauce and chocolate ganache on top of that, like fudge almost, and walnuts, and you just pour on the toppings and just make this decadent, rich, amazing dish. Yeah, it was so dense mud in the Mississippi River Valley. I don't remember what state it was, but John Deere went out west. He was a New Englander. He went out west, and a big problem that they found was even though this farmland is amazing, we can't plow it with our big old clunky iron plows. The mud sticks to the plow, and you have to stop every couple feet to scrape the mud off, and it's just not working. So he invented a steel plow that was self-sharpening, that was so sharp and so polishable that the mud just slid right off and made all this excellent farmland actually usable. And that's how John Deere got his thing. Root beer was invented in Biloxi, Mississippi. Root beer, as many sodas were invented as a cough syrup type thing. It was supposed to be this health thing. Dr. Pepper is one of the first major sodas, and Dr. Pepper was designed to be a kind of healthy thing for you. Pep means energy, so it's Dr. Pick Me Up, you might say. And it would be this sweet syrup that you would just drink a spoonful of it to like soothe a cough or a sore throat. I don't know if you've ever had a spoonful of honey to soothe a sore throat. This is before cough drops are really popular. And then later, people started adding it to soda water, to seltzer, because seltzer has been popular way, way long ago, like the early 1500s. People were enjoying seltzer water, naturally carbonated from the ground. So if there's a baking soda mine and water goes through it, it picks up the baking soda and gets bubbly. So that's cool. There are naturally carbonated springs out there. Anyway, carbonated water is a little bit bitter because of the minerals in there. So people would add sugar and fruit juice and stuff to it, and then they're like, "Hey, what if we put Dr. Pepper in this? Delicious. What if we put root beer syrup in this? Ooh, delicious." So root beer gets its name, and ginger ale as well, from the process of making it, which is a fermentation process. You get different roots of different things like sarsaparilla or ginger root, and you chop it up and you add some sugar and then you let it ferment. The way that they did it, though, I don't know exactly what they did, but different bacteria that ferments produces different things. So one type of bacteria ferments sugar into alcohol, another type of bacteria ferments sugar into vinegar, and I don't know exactly what happened here, but they invented a non-alcoholic fermentation process. You know, pickles are technically fermented because they have that vinegar in there. I don't know. So they have this kind of similar to alcohol brewing process, but non-alcoholic. That's why it's called root beer. It's beer, but it's not alcoholic. It's ginger ale. It's ale, but it's not alcoholic. Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi. That's fun. The first human lung and heart transplant was at the University of Mississippi. A lot of universities have been at the forefront of medical research, and therefore a lot of universities have hospitals attached to them where they put into practice their new ideas. The major hospital in Vermont is the one that my family would always go to, the UVM Medical Center, University of Vermont Medical Center. Every time I've been there, there's been a doctor who had a teenager with him, was like, "Hey, there's a college student. Do you mind if they watch?" And I'm like, okay, I'm just bleeding over here, but sure, get the 20-year-old to stitch me up. Mississippi is the last state to remove the Confederate flag in 2021. They voted it in 2020, made it official in 2021. So after the Civil War, they added a Confederate flag to their state flag. And there is the old one from the 1860s forward as a Confederate flag right there. And of course, that is a symbol of racism. It is. People talk about it being a symbol of history. It's a symbol of racist history. It's a symbol of oppression. If the Confederates won, we would still have slavery in America today. So some people argue that not all Confederates were pro-slavery. Well, enough were pro-slavery that if the Confederates won, we would still have slaves today. Some people like the Confederate flag for its history. I don't like Confederate history. Confederate history was wrong. Anyway, enough people felt that way that eventually in 2021 they changed it. And here is the modern flag. I think it is really sharp. I like that. There's a number of stars here. Go ahead and count them. That's the number of statehood, the order in which they joined. Has a magnolia. Is that a magnolia? I think it's magnolia because they had a magnolia tree in their original flag. It was just white with this blue tree in the middle. Um, so they had a throwback to that. It says, "In God we trust." That is the only state flag that has the word God in it. The yellow star up above, this like funky diamond shape, is apparently a symbol of one of the Native American tribes that was there. Use this kind of off-center diamond in their decorations and their clothing all the time. So they added that as one of their stars. That's pretty cool. I think it's really sharp, and I'm very glad that Mississippi's trying to move forward and do the right thing and not be stuck in the racist past. Good for you, Mississippi. Louisiana next. 3/10, 3 out of 10 of the biggest ports, the busiest ports in America are in Louisiana. And of course, New Orleans, Louisiana is the biggest one of those. New Orleans is famous for Hurricane Katrina, which came in, and it's called a century storm. This is the biggest storm we'll get in 100 years. Once in 100 years, we'll get one this big. But New Orleans is below sea level, which is kind of a problem. It has the ocean on one side, and just on the other side of it, there's a massive lake. So it's in between an ocean and a lake, and there's all these dams. They call them levees. A levee is a dam that goes parallel to a river, so it's not stopping a river, it's alongside of the river. So if the river ever floods, it can go straight up instead of out into the city. Well, these levees were rated for such a powerful storm, like a Category 3 hurricane, but then they had an even worse hurricane than that, and it came in and broke several levees and flooded a massive part of the city. Extreme devastation. Thankfully, they did get most people evacuated, and the people who were not evacuated, many of them did get to safety in places like the Saints Stadium, New Orleans Saints football team, a massive stadium designed to resist much heavier damage, so most of them were safe there. What Katrina is famous for, besides just the utter devastation, is the really slow response. We have a government organization called FEMA, the Federal Emergency something or other. Sorry, FEMA is supposed to be in charge of taking care of these huge emergencies, swooping right in and helping. And they took forever to do anything. It was very mismanaged. They were not prepared. And they're making all these excuses like, well, we didn't know. Well, that's the point of emergencies, things like that. They should be prepared in an emergency. But because so much of New Orleans was damaged, you have tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people homeless, and many of them are just going across the country. Some of them find relatives to stay in. But there's hotels that are jam-packed with people who want to stay there long term. FEMA eventually brings in thousands and thousands of trailers for people to live in. They're getting water and food. But there was a much bigger and better response from private charities. I mean, Red Cross swooped in. Dozens of churches swooped in with food and blankets and clothes and stuff because people lost everything. And it took years to rebuild. It was a really nasty, nasty hurricane. Louisiana is also famous for Mardi Gras. They have the Mardi Gras colors, purple, yellow, and green. Mardi Gras is this massive parade that's also known for its indulgence in various things. So a lot of alcohol, a lot of sweet treats, cinnamon rolls, and things like that. Then a lot of nudity and other problems. And they do this right at the start of Lent. So the Catholic practice of Lent is you give up something, you fast from some kind of treat, chocolate or soda or alcohol or something. So you do that for a month to show your devotion to God. But before Lent, you need to have this massive party to get all your sin out. So not the best holiday ever, new. Come down to the Louisiana Delta. This is a very lowland area, very swampy and marshy. And because it is so low and the currents in the Gulf are so strong, we are losing many acres of Louisiana swamp every year. All that dirt is just being pulled out to sea, which is kind of creepy, especially if you live there, if you own property there. You might own a house, and in a few years, your house is gone. It's been swept out to sea. There's just water there. Now you own some water. So not cool. Of course, all that mud is being deposited somewhere else, so someone else is gaining some land, but Louisiana is losing some land. People who live here in the swamp, there's two distinct groups that a lot of people can't tell the difference between. You have the Cajuns and the Creoles. So Cajuns come from Acadia in Canada, so they are French. They came down here 100 years ago. Yeah, actually, about 100, 120, 150 years ago, came down here. Then you also have the Creoles, who are Spanish, who came up. But Creole means a mixture of languages, a mixture of cultures. So you have the French, you have the Spanish, you have the English who came in. You have, of course, the Native Americans, who have always been a big presence here in Louisiana. Then you have all the African slaves. So you have a mix of five main cultures that are all playing off one another, and they create these brand new styles of cooking, styles of language. Look up a Cajun accent or a Creole accent. It is something else, man. Uh, they have a lot of African words thrown in there, and African grammar as well, some French grammar. There are some Cajun and Creole dishes like gumbo that are this weird mix of French cooking and Spanish cooking and native ingredients. So when I think Cajun and Creole cooking, I think a lot of spicy food. Well, all that spicy stuff is native to Mexico, Texas, this area. All those hot peppers native to here. A famous part of gumbo is called andouille sausage. And andouille sausage is Spanish. It's spelled with two L's, Anduille. That's a Spanish type of sausage. So you have Spanish sausage, you have a French preparation, you have native ingredients, and you have some African stuff thrown in there as well. It's just this whole mix. Oh, you know what else is really popular in the South is okra. Okra looks like these little bean pods, and it gets super slimy when you cook it, which sounds really gross, but if you put it in a soup or stew, it thickens up the stew like you would put maybe cornstarch in there in a northern stew. They put in okra. Okra is a West African plant that the slaves brought over and now is very popular in the South. So this mix, Spanish, French, British, Native American, Mexican, Spanish. Did I say Spanish? African, all sorts of stuff, all mixed up together. And you have this bayou down by the bayou. So cool. I mean, that's literal definition of melting pot, isn't it? That's just everything. Jambalaya. Anyway, a lot of people on the Gulf fish and shrimp. There's some of our most popular shrimping places down there in the Gulf. There's also a lot of oil in the Gulf of Mexico. And as we've gotten better drilling techniques, we've been able to drill off the shore of of the Gulf of Mexico and make a lot of money with that. Unfortunately, in 2010, there was a massive oil spill when one of these oil drills way out to sea had a problem. And it took the entire summer to fix the problem. All the while, it is belching out billions of gallons of crude oil just right into the Pacific. It made this massive, Atlantic, sorry, made this massive dead zone where all the fish and clams and shrimp and everything in this massive area all breathe in the oil and die. So, of course, fish breathe the air that's dissolved in the water through their gills. What happens if they get oil slicking their gills? They can't breathe, they suffocate, they die. Uh, all the seabirds that dove down into the water to try to find something, their feathers get coated with petroleum and they can't fly anymore. They're dead. All the sharks, all the dolphins, all the whales, everything, it's dead. Even on shore, if you have clams there, the clams are either dead and rotten or they have petroleum in them and you can't eat them. So a massive part of Louisiana's economy was sunk because of that. There was a court case and they found out that BP was responsible. They had not taken the safety measures that they should have. And so they were forced to pay Louisiana fishers and shrimpers billions. I think it was like $300 billion that they had to distribute to these people because it's like 3 or 4 years worth of salary before they can get it all cleaned up and out to sea. So there are multiple ways to try to clean up this oil. It does float, thankfully, so you can try to skim it off the top. There was this massive drive to get hair clippings from all the barbers in America because hair acts as a really nice sponge. And they can just throw out bales and bales and bales of human hair onto the Gulf of Mexico. It soaks up all the petroleum, and then you can scoop it up and throw it away. Um, okay. Unfortunately, because of all the waves, it does mix in the oil into the water a little bit more, so it's not just as simple as picking that up. But for years afterward, this was 2010. For many years afterwards, if you go walking on the beaches, you'll see these globs of tar have been washed up the sea, and the Gulf is still cleaning itself. The Gulf is still getting back to the way it was. Now, one major problem was that it was like a mile of pipe from the surface of the water down. So it wasn't as simple as, oh, just put a cork in it. It was like, it was very, very difficult. Texas is next. Of course, don't mess with Texas. They have this very, very American attitude of, come at me, bro. What you gonna do about it? Very independent, and maybe a little aggressive, but that's just part of their culture. Don't mess with it. There's lots of plains in Texas, not as much rainfall, which means that it's perfect for animals. Not enough water for a really good farm in a lot of it, although, of course, Texas is so big, there are different places in it. But enough water for grass, and so it's enough for cows and sheep, so they're famous for their herding. They also have a lot of coastline as well, and when I think Texas, I don't necessarily think beaches, but Houston is right there on the beach or close by. You have Galveston. Maybe you've heard of Galveston before. Ask Mrs. Wilbur about that. You have Corpus Christi, Texas. There's military bases there. You have Matagorda. You have some really massive tourist places where people come to the white sandy beaches. You have the fishing, the shrimping, the oil in Texas as well. Texas is so massive that it takes hours upon hours to drive from place to place. So the geography is different from place to place. The culture is different from place to place, and it's hard to pin down a specific Texas culture. But they are typically very proud of their state, proud to be Texans, maybe a little bit more than other states are, which is fine. They're pretty cool. They have a lot of good things going for them. Lots of oil has been found in Texas. Texas was one of America's first drilling sites, both on land and in the water. And 3 out of 10 of America's biggest cities are in Texas. You have Houston, Austin, and what would the other one be? San Antonio? I think that would be it. Yeah, some massive, massive cities in Texas. So maybe when you think Texas, you think rural cowboy, and they definitely have tons and tons of cowboys. They have country hicks, they have the rednecks, but then they also have the really refined city life, high heels and power ties and things like that. They have everything in between as well. City, suburb, country, farm, desert. In the far south of Texas, that's almost like a jungle. They have palm trees and lots of rain in the far south. In the far north, you have just brutal desert, saguaro cacti, that kind of thing. All sorts of stuff in Texas.